So as we continue our look at plant anatomy, we've gotten the really sort of large anatomical features out of the way, i.e. we've looked at the plant organs. Now we're going to shift and look at the tissue systems in greater detail. So we'll entitle this next flowchart Tissue Systems 1, and we'll go through each of those tissue systems one by one. Remember, every organ contains all three tissue systems. So now these tissue systems are going to be sort of widely spread out throughout the plant. These tissue systems are continuous throughout the plant for that reason, because every plant has organs, and then every organ has all three tissue systems, as we'll see. So the first tissue system I want to focus on is the dermal, TS for tissue system. Now, our basic function here of the dermal tissue system will be a protective covering. It's essentially just an outer protective, dermal just means outside or skin, outer protective covering of this organism in question, of our plant organism. So ORG for organism. What is this protection? What is it against? Or what is it protecting against, I should say? And that is specifically going to provide a nice function of defense against dangerous pathogens, let's say like bacteria, viruses. They also infect plants. Don't think plants are immune to them. They are not. And also physical damage. So let's say something scrapes by a plant, it doesn't just disintegrate, right? It actually stays pretty much strong, and that's because it has a dermal tissue system protecting it, covering the outside. Furthermore, dermal tissue systems can be looked at in two different ways. And the first way to look at a dermal tissue system is to look at it in non-woody plants. Plants that do not have, strong wood component or structures. Think of plants that are, simply growing out of the ground, not the trees that you think of, not large, sort of robust plants. We're looking at non-woody plants. They're going to have a dermal tissue system that consists of a system or subset of the system known as the epidermis. So the epidermis, epi just means around, and the dermis would mean skin, right? Here is just going to be a single layer, just one, a single layer of tightly packed epidermal cells. So of tightly packed, I'll just say cells here, because it's implied that the epidermis is made up of epidermal cells. So they're going to be tightly packed to give this nice tight skin structure. And then also in non-woody plants, there's going to be this other sort of component to their dermal tissue system known as the cuticle. The cuticle goes on top of the epidermis. So I'll say it covers the epidermis, to be a little more scientific here. It's essentially a waxy covering. And we've seen this before, we've mentioned this before a couple of times already. It's a waxy coating that's seen on top of the epidermis, and finally it prevents water loss, i.e. it prevents desiccation, drying out as well. So you don't want to lose all this water, let it evaporate out to the system, into the environment, because it took a lot of work to bring it all the way up to the leaf, let's say, all the way up to the tallest tree. So you prevent the water loss by making sure there's a cuticle waxy coating around the overall epidermis dermal tissue. Now, in non-woody plants, that's the story. But what about woody plants? So, like trees, think here. So, woody plants. Here, the epidermis is actually not going to be present. It's actually going to initially be there, but the epidermis gets replaced by a new structure. It gets replaced by something known as the periderm. So we sort of change our way of looking at this, because the periderm is actually going to be a structure that surrounds older regions. So the periderm will be specifically in older regions of stem and root. So we'll see this in a little bit more detail as we move forward, this periderm, when we look a little bit more at these woody plants and what they really consist of on the cellular level. So more on this periderm later. Just know that non-woody have the epidermis, woody have the epidermis that's replaced by a periderm, and also the cuticle. And then finally, to close out the dermal tissue, we'll look at some basic functions of this. We've already established a couple. We'll look at this in a little bit more detail. Dermal tissue, major function is absorption, actually. And we looked at this in the first flowchart. Absorption is going to be specifically at the root hairs. So remember the roots, they have this substructure within their overall organ, and that is root hairs. Root hairs come from epidermal cells. Epidermal cells are part of the dermal tissue system. So of course they're going to be involved in absorption, getting the water, getting the nutrients from the soil. That's where root hairs are found. In addition, guard cells are a specific subset, a specific type, very specialized form of dermal tissue that's going to be, we'll write this down as specialized, I'll write it down to make it very clear, specialized epidermal cells that are going to be in the shoots. So we're looking above ground. So we looked at things that were below ground, root hairs, absorption. Here now we're looking at guard cells, specialized epidermal cells that are going to be in the shoots, so the above ground structures. What do? Their main job is gas exchange. Very important in gas exchange, getting CO2 in, taking O2 out. And then finally, last thing in terms of function is even more specialization. So guard cells are a specialized form of dermal tissue. Another specialized form of this dermal tissue found in some plants is going to be the following. Some plants will be with something known as a characteristic, so it's very clear, very defining characteristic known as trichomes. Trichomes, I don't think that's how you say it. I think it's trichomes. These are also going to be specialized, so very well differentiated, in other words. Specialized epidermal cells, EC for epidermal cells, in the shoots, just like the guard cells, but they're going to have a different function, different specialization than gas exchange, let's say. Their job is actually interesting because they can actually be mainly found in a lot of desert species of plants. So you might be wondering, how do these guys survive? Well, trichomes are going to be important in their survival because they are very good at decreasing water loss, so decrease H2O loss. And if you decrease H2O loss, there's another thing that's important with this desert species that have trichomes as part of their dermal tissue, and that's also the fact that trichomes are very good at reflecting sunlight. Specifically, I want to say excess sunlight, because sunlight is good, but in excess, it'll dry out the plant. So if you reflect the excess and decrease your water loss and you're a desert species, you're probably using a trichome, which is a type of dermal tissue that's very specialized, epidermal cells. And also, finally, last thing, in other species that are not, let's say, desert species, the trichomes actually function as a very interesting form of insect defense. If you look at figure 35.9 in your textbook, it actually shows that these trichomes are like these barb-like structures that really sort of infiltrate these insects and cause these insects harm, essentially, by either secreting toxins or some sort of sticky component that's going to make these insects very, very annoyed. So it's a very interesting defense mechanism as a part of the dermal tissue. So remember, dermal tissue is on the outside of the plant, and it's a protective covering that is very good at its job because of these functions and the non-woody and woody distinction that we established.